Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Matiullah, Associate Professor of Medicine, and today I will be discussing the topic of poisoning and drug overdose. This topic will be covered in two parts, and in this first part we will mainly discuss basics and general management of patients suspected of poisoning, and in the end we will discuss one specific type of poisoning due to the most commonly involved drug paracetamol. We will open our discussion with quoting Paracelsus, who was a 16th century Swiss physician who noted that the dose makes the poison, thereby noting that poison is not an inherent property of a substance, rather its dose makes it a poison. Thus, poisoning is defined as development of dose-related adverse effects following exposure to chemicals, drugs, or toxins. It should be noted that in excessive amounts, substances that are usually innocuous, such as oxygen and water, can cause toxicity, while on the other hand, in small doses, substances commonly regarded as poisons, such as arsenic and cyanide, can be consumed without ill effect or even with therapeutic intent. It should be noted that individual variability in the response to a given dose may occur, and this variability in individual response is multifactorial. The most common factor is because of genetic polymorphism, which means small changes in genetic code make variable metabolism of the same drug, so every individual responds differently to the same dose of the same substance. Another is enzyme induction or inhibition in the presence of other chemicals. For example, if a person is taking a drug which is a hepatic enzyme inducer, his threshold for poisoning because of several substances may be increased, because the metabolism of these substances will be enhanced in his body because of the induced hepatic enzymes. Another one is the acquired tolerance. If small doses, repeated doses of a same substance are given over a prolonged period, that patient may develop tolerance to it. For example, patients chronically taking benzodiazepines don't find so much sedation with the same dose which is commonly used for other individuals. They become tolerant for it, and they don't respond in the same way as other people who are not tolerant. Another point is the severity and reversibility of poisoning also depends on the functional reserve of the individual or target organ, which is influenced by age and comorbidity. So young people tolerate poisoning better than older people, and those with advanced diseases, for example renal or hepatic failure, also do worse with poisoning because of difficulty in eliminating the substance from the body. Poisoning is a relatively commonly encountered problem in medical practice and accounts for about 5 to 10% of all ambulance transports, emergency department visits, and intensive care units. But mortality is usually low, and most patients recover with the conservative management only, and the overall mortality is less than 1%, but it is higher in intentional or suicidal attempts than accidental cases. Paracetamol is the agent most often implicated in fatal intentional poisoning cases, while in accidental exposure, carbon monoxide, and overall the leading cause of death is exposure to carbon monoxide, which is usually accidental, but it rarely accounts for a hospital admission because these people are usually found dead at their residential places. Early and correct diagnosis of poisoning is important for a good outcome, and it should be remembered that poisoning can mimic other illnesses. Correct diagnosis can usually be established by history, physical examination, assisted with routine and toxicological laboratory evaluations, and also over characteristic clinical course of the illness. The most important points to be noted in history are time, route, duration, and circumstances of exposure, the name and amount of each drug, chemical, or ingredient involved, the time of onset, nature and severity of symptoms, and time lag between the intake of the drug and development of symptoms, the time and type of first aid measures provided, and medical and psychiatric history of the patient. This history should be taken from the patient if he is conscious and cooperative, or otherwise from family members or colleagues or bystanders who have observed the patient or brought him to the hospital. The suspicious points in history which point towards possible poisoning are unexplained sudden illness in a previously healthy person or a group of healthy people, if many people are involved, a history of psychiatric problem in the patient, particularly depression, recent changes in health, economic status, or social relationships which may make him depressed and take a suicidal attempt, or onset of illness while working with chemicals or after ingesting some food, drink, especially ethanol, or medications. So as I already told, if the patient is drowsy, unconscious, or is non-cooperative, then the history should be taken from family members, friends or colleagues or observers who bring the patient to the hospital. Physical examination should focus especially on vital signs, and core temperatures should especially be taken. And as we have already discussed, that core temperatures are represented by rectal or esophageal thermometers, and this is a parameter which has highest prognostic significance, because patients with poisoning who present with very high or very low temperature has the worst outcome. So this is a single most important prognostic point, alteration in temperature. Then neurological status should be observed. Neuromuscular abnormalities such as dyskinesia, dystonia, fasciculation, myoclonus, rigidity, and tremors are quite common in poisoning. And also nystagmus, pupil size, and reactivity should be observed. However, focal neurological findings are uncommon in poisoning, and if present, then other causes of the condition should be kept in mind. Focus on cardiopulmonary status, for example, hemodynamic stability, should also be noted. The patient should also be examined for evidence of trauma and underlying illnesses. Patient should be looked for chemical burns if he has been exposed to some chemical. Sometimes the odor of breath, vomitus, and the color of nail, skin, and urine can point towards the possible toxin. After examination, you should be able to characterize the overall physiological status of the patient, which can be described as stimulated, depressed, discordant, and normal, which may give clue to some possible diagnosis. By stimulated physiological state, of course, we mean that everything physiological parameters are stimulated. For example, the pulse rate will be increased, blood pressure will be high, respiratory rate will be high, temperature will be high, and neuromuscular activity will be increased, which may even lead to seizures. This is usually caused by sympathetic, antimuscarinic, anticholinergic drugs, hallucinogen poisoning, and drug withdrawal from various drugs. In stimulated physiological state, further points may differentiate between different groups of drugs. For example, poisoning by sympathetic drugs will present with dilated but responsive pupils, because pupil constriction is a parasympathetic act, and this part is intact. So pupils are dilated but they are responsive. There will be diaphoresis or excessive sweating, pallor, and increased bowel activity with nausea, vomiting, abnormal distress, and occasionally diarrhea. There may be tachycardia, high BP, and organ ischemia, which are more prominent in these cases due to sympathetic drug poisoning. While on the other hand, antimuscarinic, anticholinergic drug poisoning will present with mydriasis, which is dilated and non-responsive pupils, and the patient will have hot, dry, and flushed skin. There will be no sweating and decreased bowel sounds and urinary retention because of the anticholinergic effects. So inside the stimulated physiological state, variable parameters also point towards possible etiology. A depressed physiological state means that everything of the cardiovascular or neurological examination is depressed. For example, pulse rate will be decreased, blood pressure will be low, respiratory will be low, temperature will be low, and neuromuscular activity will be depressed, and there will be miosis or pupillary constriction. The major involved drugs are sympatholytics, cholinergic, muscarinic, and nicotinic agents, opioids, and sedative hypnotic drugs. Pronounced cardiovascular depression in the absence of significant CNS depression suggests a sympatholytic cause, while on the other hand, opioid and sedative hypnotic poisoning, vital sign changes are secondary to depression of CNS. cardiovascular and respiratory centers. So in opioid and sedative hypnotic drugs, CNS depression is the primary manifestation, and cardiovascular and respiratory depression are secondary to the depression of central centers of these systems, and meiosis is often prominent in these cases. Discordant physiological state is characterized by mixed vital signs and neuromuscular abnormalities. Some parameters will be high and some will be low. Manifestations of physiological stimulation and physiological depression can occur together or at different times during the clinical course. For example, a patient with poisoning may present with activated form, stimulated physiological state, and later on may go into depression, or may have mixed sign, stimulated or depressed at the same time in on presentation. So alternatively, vital signs may be normal, but the patient has altered mental status or is obviously sick or clearly symptomatic. Poisoning by asphyxiants, which block the electron transport chain in the oxidative phosphorylation pathway. The best example is cyanide. Membrane active agents, for example antiarrhythmic drugs, and anion gap metabolic acidosis inducers, for example ethylene glycol, are the major substances involved in this discordant type of physiological state. And normal physiological status, the patient's parameters are all normal. His BP, pulse, temperature, everything is normal, and he is not stimulated by neuromuscular. There is no neuromuscular overactivity or underactivity. So it's a normal physiological status. This may occur either due to a non-toxic exposure, means the patient has been exposed but the dose has been non-toxic, or there may be a psychogenic illness, or poisoning by so-called toxic time bombs, the substances which present with delayed symptoms. These are the agents which are slowly absorbed or slowly distributed, or they require metabolic activation first before becoming toxic, or they disrupt metabolic processes. Especially nowadays, with a trend towards once-a-day formulation of most of the drugs, these drugs are made in a slow release formulation, so they have delayed symptoms and they are becoming now increasingly common. So observation for appropriate time is important in this case. Patient has an exposure by history and examination, but currently he looks stable. He should be observed for an appropriate time, so that for a delayed manifestation of clinical symptoms may appear. So on the basis of this initial physical examination, you may be able to categorize the patient into various toxic syndromes, or the so-called toxidromes, which point about towards the specific etiology of poisoning. Here are some examples of common toxidromes. For example, acute exposure to solvents, anesthetic or sedative toxidrome. Patient presents with central nervous system depression leading to decreased level of consciousness, progressing to coma in some cases, depressed respiration, and in some cases ataxia, which is difficulty in balancing and walking. Another is anticholinergic toxidrome, presents with dilated pupil, decreased sweating, elevated temperature, and mental status changes, including characteristic hallucinations. Another is cholinergic toxidrome, also called pesticide or nerve agent, because most commonly involved are carbamate and organophosphate pesticides. They will present with first activation and then fatigue of target organs, leading to pinpoint pupils, wheezing, twitching, and excessive secretions, the so-called leaking all over, with excessive bronchial secretions, sweat, tears, saliva, vomiting, incontinence. Anticoagulants toxidrome, when excessive anticoagulants are consumed, present with alteration of blood coagulation, excessive bruising and bleeding from mucous membranes and wounds, as well as sometimes internal bleeding, for example intracranial or retroperitoneal bleeding in severe cases. Convulsant toxidrome is produced by central nervous system excitation, leading to generalized convulsion. Then irritant corrosive toxidrome range from minor irritation of exposed skin, mucous membranes, pulmonary and gastrointestinal tract, to coughing, wheezing, respiratory distress, and more severe GI symptoms that may progress rapidly to systemic toxicity. Then opioid toxidromes, quite common. Opioid agonism leading to pinpoint pupils and central nervous system and respiratory depression. Then stress response or sympathomimetic toxidrome, present with stress or toxicant induced catecholamine excess or central nervous system excitation leading to confusion, panic, increased pulse, respiration and blood pressure. So these are the various syndromes with which the patient may present, and these conditions, these apparent physiological state point towards the possible etiological agent. Lab evaluation. In addition to routine lab counts, liver and renal profile and electrolytes, anion gap should be calculated, which is done by sodium minus chloride and bicarbonate combined, which should be around 12 plus minus 2. If it is increased, then there is a possibility of non-measured organic acid inside the blood, so some acidosis may be there. Another one is osmolar gap, which is calculated by difference between measured and calculated osmolality, and if this gap is also increased, means a small osmotically active molecule is present in the plasma. ECG should be done to look for a variety of arrhythmias which are quite common. Radiological studies as needed, most commonly chest x-ray if you are suspecting non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema or aspiration pneumonia, or sometimes abdominal x-rays to find radiopaque objects in the abdomen which may be the source of poisoning. Toxicological analysis of urine and blood, and sometimes from the gastric content which has been aspirated, is also sent for laboratory workup. Sometimes response to antidote administered to suspected substance can give a clue to possible etiology. For example, if you suspect a etiological agent, give a specific antidote and patient responds dramatically, then the presence of that substance is confirmed. Now coming to management, it should be remembered that general conservative management is most important in the management of poisoning. This is because of two reasons. First of all, most poisoning cases do not have a specific antidote. Number two, most of these poisoning cases spontaneously recover. Only you need to keep the patient stable during this period when this substance is eliminated naturally from the body. So initial assessment should be quickly assessing the danger. Patient may be initially asymptomatic, although he may have ingested the lethal dose of toxin. It should be remembered, very important point, as we have discussed, patient may have presented earlier, or he may have ingested some slow release type of formulation and the development of symptoms may be delayed. So apparently stable person does not mean that patient is not very sick. So it is important to quickly assess the potential danger by history and physical examinations. Consider gut and skin decontamination to prevent further absorption. This is especially important in the pre-toxic phase, but if the patient is presented with delayed symptoms, then it is less significant. Then treat complication if they occur. Various complications can occur during poisoning, and observe the asymptomatic patient for an appropriate interval, at least 4 to 6 hours or even longer if a long slow release formulation has been suspected, if it is indicated. The management of poisoned patient is in 5 steps. These are 5 steps which we will further discuss in detail. Support of vital signs, which, as I already told, that is the most important point. The other is prevention of further poison absorption or by decontamination, which is especially important in earlier cases, pre-toxic phases, but with time it becomes less and less important. Enhancement of poison elimination from the body, whichever has been absorbed should be eliminated if possible. Administration of specific antidotes if available, but most of the poisons do not actually have a specific antidote, but if available should be given. And prevention of re-exposure after patient has recovered from the this acute episode. Admission to intensive care unit is indicated in certain circumstances, which include the patient with severe poisoning. For example, if the patient presents with coma, respiratory depression, hypotension, cardiac conduction abnormalities, cardiac arrhythmias, hypothermia or hyperthermia, or seizures. These are all indicators for admission to ICU. For those people who need close monitoring or who require antidotes or enhanced elimination therapy should also be admitted to intensive care. Those showing progressive clinical deterioration despite management, and those with significant underlying medical problems, for example, sick patients or who have underlying cardiac, pulmonary, hepatic or renal compromise, should be admitted to ICU. These are the 5 steps briefly. Supportive care includes airway protection if the patient is comatose, oxygenation ventilation if he presents with hypoxemia or with respiratory depression, treatment of arrhythmias if they occur, hemodynamic support, treatment of seizures, correction of temperature abnormalities, correction of metabolic derangements, prevention of secondary complications. The second step is prevention of further poison absorption. GI decontamination, there are various methods of that. For example, gastric lavage, activated charcoal, whole bowel irrigation, dilution of the substance which has been ingested, endoscopic or even surgical removal from the body of a substance which is a source of poisoning. Decontamination of other sites include eye decontamination, skin decontamination, and body cavity evacuation. Third step is enhancement of poison elimination. Multiple dose activated charcoal facilitates removal from the GIT. Alteration in urinary pH sometimes facilitates elimination of certain substances from the urine. Chelation in cases of heavy metal poisoning. Extracorporeal removal in advanced cases. Various methods are available. For example, hemodialysis, hemoperfusion, hemofiltration, plasmapheresis, in which you take out the blood in extracorporeal circulation, remove plasma and replace it with some colloid or crystallized solution and return the blood to the patient. Exchange transfusion, in which the blood containing some toxin is removed and is replaced by healthy blood from a donor. Or hyperbaric oxygen, especially in cases of carbon monoxide poisoning. Fourth step is the administration of antidotes. Neutralization by antibodies is important. For example, in poisoning due to digoxin, neutralization by chemical binding. Other mechanism by which these antidotes act is metabolic antagonism or physiological antagonism. For example, vitamin K as a metabolic antagonist to warfarin. Then finally, when the patient has recovered, prevention of re-exposure by adult education, child proofing, or in cases of intentional poisoning or suicidal, notification to regulatory agencies and psychiatric referral. This is an example of child proofing. This is obviously a very dangerous scenario, but if you cover this socket, then it is child proofed. So now we discuss the first step, supportive care, which, as I've already told, is the most important, because most patients with poisoning will recover spontaneously, only they need time, and you need to keep them stable and prevent from any complications if they occur during the course of the illness, and the patient will recover spontaneously over time. So this supportive care mainly consists of treatment of complications. Treatment of life-threatening complication take precedence over in-depth diagnostic evaluation. So, which is the obvious complication with which the patient has presented, you should treat it as a complication and don't go into in-depth evaluation what is the underlying cause. One common complication is coma, which is associated with ingestion of benzodiazepines or other sedative hypnotics, ethanol, opioids, antipsychotic drugs, or antidepressant poisoning. This is the most common cause of death in comatose patients is respiratory failure, which may occur abruptly, so you should observe closely. Aspiration of gastric contents can also occur because they cannot protect their airway, so it can cause chemical pneumonia and worsen the condition and make the recovery less likely. Hypoxemia may cause or aggravate hypotension, arrhythmias, or seizures. So the main thing is protection of airway and respiratory support if respiratory depression occurs. The initial emergency management of coma can be remembered by the mnemonic ABCD, which stands for airway, breathing, circulation, and drugs. First, maintain an IV line and draw blood sample for routine investigations. Then attend the airway. Maintain a patent airway by suction, oropharyngeal airway, or endotracheal intubation if necessary. This we will discuss shortly. Then breathing, assess breathing, give oxygen if hypoxic or provide assistance if necessary with a bag valve mask device or a mechanical ventilator, whatever is required or available also. Then assess for respiratory depression, bronchospasm, pulmonary aspiration, or non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema by appropriate investigations. And circulation, measure the pulse and blood pressure and estimate tissue perfusion by urine output. Continuous cardiac monitoring is usually required. This is an oropharyngeal airway, and this is how it is inserted to protect the airway. You can see the unconscious patient when he is given a oropharyngeal airway. It prevents the tongue from falling and collapse of the pharyngeal muscles, so that the airway is protected and breathing is maintained. This is a cuffed endotracheal tube and is inserted like this inside the trachea, and the cuff is inflated to prevent aspiration into the lungs. These are the various mechanisms of protection of airway. This is a bag valve face mask device for assisted ventilation. This can be attached to a face mask for non-invasive supportive ventilation, or it can be attached to the endotracheal tube also to give an invasive ventilation support. And there is a port for oxygen inlet for hypoxemia as well. The next step, A, B, C, D. D is for drugs. The drugs which you will first give to these patients. First one is dextrose. If suspected or confirmed hypoglycemia, give 50 ml of 50% intravenous dextrose. If there is a system available for immediate bedside checking of blood sugar level, then it's good, and if hypoglycemia is detected, you treat it. But if it is not available, then empirically you can give this dextrose, because many cases with hypoglycemia develop a coma, and many patients with coma due to various poisoning can develop hypoglycemia. So it is worth giving. The other drug is thiamine. For all alcoholics, give 100 mg by intramuscular injection or by intravenous infusion in a solution dilution. Naloxone, if suspected of opioid poisoning, this is a specific antidote to opioid. If the patient presents with depressed respiration, give 0.4 to 2 mg intravenously, but the dose may need to be repeated because it's a short-acting antidote, and most of the opioid have a longer half-life than naloxone. Another one is flumazenil. If patient is suspected of benzodiazepine poisoning, because it's a specific antidote, give 0.2 to 0.5 mg intravenously, and it also may require repeated dosing because it's also a short-acting agent. But caution should be exercised because it may induce seizures if it is given to a person who has also ingested a convulsant drug, or a patient who is a long-standing user of benzodiazepine, because sudden withdrawal of the effect may precipitate seizures. Or if a patient is already having a seizure disorder, in these patients it should be avoided because it can precipitate a seizure. Another complication is hypothermia. Commonly accompanies coma due to opioids, ethanol, hypoglycemics, phenothiazines, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and other sedative hypnotics and CNS depressants. This usually is treated by gradual rewarming, which is usually sufficient. But if the patient is in cardiac arrest, we have already discussed, it will require a high quality cardiopulmonary resuscitation until the patient's temperature has increased significantly. Hypotension. Many patients present with hypotension due to poisoning with the antihypertensive drugs, especially beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, and disulfiram due to its interaction with ethanol, iron, trazodone, quetiapine, and other antipsychotic agents or antidepressants. This is treated by repeated doses of 200 ml of intravenous fluid, usually normal saline. Up to 1 to 2 liters should be given, but much larger amounts may be required if the victim is already profoundly volume depleted, for example a patient who is having severe diarrhea or vomiting. But if the patient does not improve with this fluid therapy, then inotropes may be required. Norepinephrine 4 to 5 microgram per minute by intravenous infusion is preferred over dopamine, and specific antidotes sometimes are effective. For example, for tricyclic antidepressants, sodium bicarbonate is usually effective. For beta blocker overdose, glucagon, which is inotrope, which specifically acts on stimulating beta receptors. So it's a type of a specific antidote to beta blockers, which is given in a dose of 5 to 10 milligram intravenously. For calcium channel blocker overdose, administer calcium chloride 1 to 2 gram intravenously. Hypertension due to poisoning with amphetamines or other stimulants, anticholinergics, cocaine, performance enhancing products like caffeine, phenylephrine, ephedrine or yohimbine, monoamine oxidase antidepressants, monoamine oxidase inhibitor antidepressants can present with hypertension. Severe hypertension defined by diastolic blood pressure of more than 105 to 110 millimeter mercury in a previously non-hypertensive patients can result in severe complications like acute intracranial hemorrhage, myocardial infarction or aortic dissection. So it should be treated rapidly with preference. Agitated patients should be given a sedative like lorazepam, which is a benzodiazepine 2 to 3 milligram intravenously, which will calm them down, and sometimes only this strategy will be sufficient to bring down the blood pressure. But if does not come down, for persistent hypertension, give phentolamine, which is the alpha blocker 2 to 5 milligram intravenous, or sodium nitroprusside, which is a both arteriolar and venular dilator at a dose of 0.25 to 8 microgram per kg per minute by a continuous infusion. If excessive tachycardia is present, you can add a short-acting beta blocker, esmolol 25 to 100 microgram per kg per minute intravenously as an infusion, or lebitalol, which is a combined alpha and beta blocker in a dose of 0.2 to 0.3 milligram per kg intravenously. But caution should be exercised. Do not give beta blockers alone because it may cause paradoxical hypertension from unprotected alpha agonism. Moreover, pure arteriolar dilators like hydralazine should be avoided because they can precipitate acute cardiac ischemia. So both arteriolar or venular dilator or alpha blockers followed by beta blockers or combined alpha and beta blockers should be given. Pure beta blockers are contraindicated. Arrhythmias are common manifestation of various drugs. This arrhythmias can occur not only due to direct effect of the drug itself, but also as a result of hypoxia, acidosis, or electrolyte imbalance. For example, hyperkalemia, hypokalemia, hypomagnesemia, or hypocalcemia, which is induced by the drug poisoning. So directly as a result, or hypoxemia, acidosis, or electrolyte imbalance induced by the drug. Treatment consists of looking for the cause of arrhythmias, for example hypoxemia, acidosis, and electrolyte abnormalities. This should be detected and treated. For persistent ventricular arrhythmias, use lignocaine and amiodarone as usual. Sodium bicarbonate should be given for tricyclic antidepressants induced ventricular tachycardia. Atypical ventricular tachycardia due to prolonged QT interval, which is called Torsades points, is treated by intravenous magnesium or overdrive pacing, in which a patient is externally paced, which will usually terminate the arrhythmia. and specific antidotes, especially for digitalis, by specific antibody fragments, Fab fragments are given, which eliminate digoxin and reduce toxicity. These are the various types of arrhythmias caused by drugs. For example, sinus bradycardia due to beta blockers, calcium blockers, clonidine, digitalis, organyl phosphates, AV block also from beta and calcium blockers, class 1 antiarrhythmics, digitalis, clonidine, carbamazepine. Sinus tachycardia can be caused by beta agonists like salbutamol, amphetamine, anticholinergics, cocaine, caffeine, pseudoephedrine or tricyclic antidepressants. Wide complex tachycardia due to class 1A and C antiarrhythmics like quinidine, phenothiazines, propranolol or lamotrigine. QT interval prolongation leading to Torsades points is usually caused by arsenic. Class 1A and 3 antiarrhythmics, citalopram, lithium, sertraline, which are antidepressants. Ventricular premature beats and ventricular tachycardia caused by amphetamines, cocaine, ephedrine, caffeine, digoxin, and theophylline. This is a classical Torsades points. You can see the baseline ECG is showing significantly prolonged QT interval, and is followed by a burst of broad complex tachycardia which seems to rotate around its axis. This is the classical Torsades points. Seizures are also commonly observed in poisoning, may be caused by many poisonous drugs including amphetamines, antidepressants, especially tricyclics, antihistamines, especially diphenhydramine, antipsychotics, cocaine, isoniazid, the antituberculous drug, chlorinated insecticides, tramadol, and theophylline. Seizures can be delayed for several hours after toxin exposure and should be observed. Patient should be observed for appropriate time. And they may also be caused by hypoxia, hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, or hyponatremia induced by poison, or also sudden withdrawal from alcohol or sedative hypnotics. Trauma to the head, central nervous system infections like meningitis and encephalitis can also lead to seizures, and the patient may already have idiopathic epilepsy. So prolonged or repeated seizures due to any cause should be immediately terminated, because they may lead to hypoxemia, metabolic acidosis, hyperthermia, and rhabdomyolysis. All these are serious complications. So seizures due to any cause should be terminated immediately. Regarding treatment, look for underlying causes like electrolyte or acid-base imbalance or hypoxia and should be treated. If the seizures persist, then intravenous lorazepam or diazepam, the benzodiazepines, are usually effective. But if the convulsions continue, then administer phenobarbital in a dose of 15-20 mg per kg slowly intravenously, and should be remembered that intravenous phenytoin or levetiracetam, which are the drugs of choice in patients presenting with idiopathic epilepsy, they are less effective and should be avoided in poisoning because they make the condition worse. Seizures caused by isoniazid may require high doses of supplemental pyridoxine, vitamin B6, which is an antidote to the drug. Neuromuscular paralysis may ultimately be required in refractory cases. Of course, this patient will have to be put on ventilator. Continuing treatment of seizures are necessary to prevent permanent neurological damage. Hyperthermia is a very serious complication, may be associated with poisoning by amphetamines and other synthetic stimulants, atropine and other anticholinergics, cocaine, salicylates, strychnine, tricyclic antidepressants, and various other medications. We have discussed this topic previously, and we know how by various mechanisms these drugs elevate the body temperature. Overdoses of serotonin reuptake inhibitors like fluoxetine or paroxetine, sertraline, or their use in combination with monoamine oxidase inhibitors can cause serotonin syndrome. Antipsychotic agents can cause neuroleptic malignant syndrome. Some anesthetics, especially halothane, can cause malignant hyperthermia, very serious condition. Severe hyperthermia in any of these conditions with temperatures higher than 40 to 41 degree can rapidly cause brain damage and multi-organ failure, including rhabdomyolysis, acute kidney injury, and coagulopathy. So body temperature should be rapidly reduced in these cases. Treatment of hyperthermia is either by evaporative measures, that is sprinkling the whole body with tap water and fanning the body for cooling, or alternatively conductive based cooling by applying ice packs to the body or immersion of the body in ice cold water. It can rapidly lower temperature, but it should be kept in mind that shivering should be avoided because it may be counterproductive. It may produce excessive heat and nullify your efforts to reducing temperature. So shivering is avoided by quick acting opioids, benzodiazepines, or even short acting anesthetics. If the temperature still remains high or if there is significant muscle stiffness, then paralysis with non-depolarizing neuromuscular blocking agents is required, which will reduce muscular activity and reduce heat production from the muscles. Dantrolene in a dose of 2 to 5 mg per kg intravenous may be effective for hyperthermia associated with muscle rigidity, and especially for malignant hyperthermia due to anesthetics. Other supportive measures in hyperthermic patients include metabolic abnormalities, correction of metabolic abnormalities, hepatic and renal dysfunction, and secondary complications, which should also be treated by standard therapies. The second step, prevention of poison absorption, consists of either GIT decontamination, induced emesis or gastric lavage. Previously had been a routine procedure in emergency for gastric emptying, but various studies have shown failed to show any improved outcome. This is usually because most of the poisons patients will improve spontaneously, and there are serious hazards associated with this type of emptying. For example, aspiration pneumonia, which may worsen and slow the recovery of the patient. Administration of activated charcoal is now the standard of care, and it should be given if the patient presents early, within 1 to 2 hours. Later on it is not efficient and should not be given, and it's found that it absorbs more than 90% of most substances within the gut lumen and reduce their absorption up to 50% if given early, within the first hour preferably, or at least up to 2 hours. But gastric lavage should be considered sometimes in life-threatening poisoning when high doses have been ingested. Another mechanism is whole bowel irrigation, which is done by bowel cleansing solution containing electrolytes and polyethylene glycol, and given at a rate of 2 liters per hour through a nasogastric tube continuously until the rectal effluent is clear. So it means it has cleansed the whole of the bowel. Decontamination of other sites, for example conjunctiva or skin. Immediate copious flushing with water, saline, or other available clear liquids. Of course, saline is the best because it's a sterile solution and isotonic with plasma. A triple wash with water, soap, again water may be best for dermal decontamination. Inhalational exposure should be treated initially by fresh air or oxygen. Solids like drug packets or pills should be removed manually. They may require endoscopy, preferably under direct visualization. Next step is enhancement of poison elimination. Forced diuresis with intravenous fluids and diuretics was previously standard, but also is associated with the hazards, so it is no more practiced. Some substances benefit from urinary alkalinization by sodium bicarbonate in 5% dextrose or hypotonic saline solution and given at a rate of 150 to 200 ml per hour to promote excretion, especially of salicylates and phenobarbital. Hemodialysis is very efficient in removing various toxins, and it's recommended for heavy and lethal doses of a dialyzable toxin. The toxin should be dialyzable, means the molecules should be small enough to pass through the membranes of the hemodialysis filter. And those who present with coma or hemodynamic instability or other serious complications of poisoning, or patients who have renal, liver, and other organ system disease which impedes elimination of the poison by natural means. Repeat dose charcoal also hastens elimination of some drugs. chelation of heavy metals, for example, iron can be chelated by desferrioxamine. Removal of carbon monoxide is facilitated by hyperbaric oxygen, which removes carbon monoxide from the hemoglobin. Fourth is administration of antidotes. There are few drugs which have available antidotes. For example, paracetamol is treated by N-acetylcysteine, digoxin treated by Fab antibody fragments, methanol and ethylene glycol can be treated by ethanol or fomepizole, which are less toxic alcohols. Methemoglobin can be treated by intravenous methylene blue, opioids by specific antidote naloxone, heparin by protamine sulfate, atropine and other cholinergic by physostigmine, which is a acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, warfarin by vitamin K, benzodiazepines by naloxone, and acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like carbamate or organophosphate pesticides treated by atropine and pralidoxime, which is a cholinesterase reactivator. These are some specific strategies for some common poisonings. For example, carbon monoxide treated by 100% oxygen or sometimes hyperbaric oxygen. Carbamazepine toxicity treated by hemodialysis. Iron is chelated by desferrioxamine. Lithium will require hemodialysis. Salicylates will require alkaline diuresis and sometimes hemodialysis. Theophylline also require hemodialysis or hemoperfusion. Valproic acid is treated with L-carnitine or hemodialysis or both together. Calcium blockers require intravenous calcium and glucagon. Beta blockers by intravenous glucagon, which is a inotropic agent which specifically activates beta receptors. And fifth step is prevention of re-exposure after recovery. Remember, poisoning is a preventable illness, but unfortunately recurrences are common, and this is frequently due to poor knowledge. Adults with unintentional exposure should be instructed regarding the safe use of medication and chemicals. Best approach towards young children and patients with intentional or suicidal overdose is to limit their access to the poisons, and depressed or psychotic patients should receive psychiatric assessment. Now we will briefly discuss poisoning with paracetamol, which is the most commonly involved drug in intentional or suicidal poisoning. Otherwise, it's a safe drug, but excessive overdose can lead to serious toxicity. A commonly used non-prescription analgesic, so easily available, no prescription is required. This is metabolized mainly by glucuronidation and sulfation, but a small fraction is metabolized via P450 mixed function oxidase system to a highly toxic reactive intermediate. This toxic intermediate is normally detoxified by cellular glutathione. With acute paracetamol overdose while ingesting more than 8 to 10 grams in an average adult, which means 16 to 20 tablets, because one tablet is half gram for average healthy adult. Hepatocellular glutathione is depleted, so the toxic intermediate cannot be eliminated. Then it causes damage to the tissues, causing extensive cell necrosis, especially in the liver. Prolonged intake of lesser amounts can cause toxicity. This should be remembered. If you take a lesser, because the dose required for acute toxicity is 16 to 20 tablets, but if a patient takes for example 8 to 10 tablets daily for several days, then it can also cause toxicity. Alcoholism and previous liver function compromise can also predispose to toxicity, because the liver is already compromised, so lesser doses can cause toxicity. Clinical features are: patients can present early with nausea and vomiting, but more serious effects present late in 24 to 48 hours. They present with fulminant hepatic necrosis resulting in jaundice, hepatic encephalopathy, acute kidney injury, and death in severe poisoning. Rarely with massive overdose, acute coma, seizures, hypotension, and metabolic acidosis unrelated to hepatic injury can occur directly from the drug itself. And treatment depends upon serum levels according to time for ingestion. You should remember this curve. This is the serum level against time from ingestion. So if the time has passed, for example 10 hours, then a lower serum level is also very toxic and dangerous. So this time versus serum level should be plotted, and decision to treat by specific antidote depends upon this curve. If the level is above this curve, then the patient should be treated. Treatment requires emergency and supportive measures by administering activated charcoal if it can be given within 1 to 2 hours after ingestion. Then specific treatment, if the serum or plasma acetaminophen or paracetamol level falls above the line on the nomogram, then treatment with N-acetylcysteine is indicated. This works by replenishing body stores of antioxidant glutathione. Oral and intravenous routes for administration of N-acetylcysteine are available. Oral treatment is by a loading dose of N-acetylcysteine 140 mg per kg followed by 70 mg per kg for every 4 hours. During this time, dilute urine with oral fluids is required to facilitate elimination of the drug and the antidote. If there is vomiting and oral drug cannot be given, then consider intravenous administration. This is done by loading dose of 150 mg per kg, which is given over 60 minutes. This is followed by a 4-hour infusion of 50 mg per kg, and then a dose of 100 mg per kg, which is given over 16 hours. So this is a total of 21-hour course of treatment by intravenous route. By this we end our part 1 of the presentation, and next week will be part 2. Thank you very much.